You're listening to Ingredients of Magic, written by Amber Fisher, narrated by Amber Fisher. For more books and audio projects, be sure to check out my website at amberfishermedia.com. 2. She ain't heavy, she's my sister. Early the next morning, Gracey pulled up the long drive in front of the Daylittle house, grateful there was no one out front to judge her for the condition of her ancient pickup truck. Her decision to walk away from the Daylittle lifestyle had been intentional, but she'd be lying if she said she felt secure in her choices when held side by side against the grandeur she'd left behind. With a sigh, she put the pickup in park and got out of the truck. She checked the time on her phone. She was 15 minutes early. Emerging from her vehicle was like walking into a sauna. It was July, the warmest time of year in Louisiana, and after 10 years in the desert, Gracey found the Louisiana air too full, too clotted with moisture to enjoy. She tried to recall breathing this air as a child, even relishing it, but each breath was so labored she wondered how anyone could live like this. Each inhale pulled her further underwater until she was sure the air itself would suffocate her. She closed her eyes against the sensation of drowning. She conjured thoughts of hot, dry air, agave, dust. She had to open her mouth to breathe, to let in enough oxygen to keep her afloat. Living was so much easier in Texas. For you, she thought sharply, her mouth arcing into a frown. Not necessarily for your sister. This is the only home she knows. You should have said something. You should have stood up for her. Gracey sighed, swallowed down her own objections. What would sticking up for Tiny have looked like anyway? A refusal to take her in? How would that have been received, she wondered. It was true that she and Tiny scarcely knew each other. But blood was blood, and no matter how hard Gracey thought on it, she could conjure no elegant way to argue that Tiny should not come home with her. Annette had already shunned her. Gracey didn't have it in her to do the same. For better or worse, taking her sister home with her was the right thing to do. Wasn't it? At 10 o'clock on the dot, Tiny emerged from the front doors, carrying 2 large suitcases and a backpack slung over her shoulder. She didn't make eye contact with Gracey as she heaved the bags into the bed of the truck. Gracey tried to help, but Tiny turned a slender shoulder to her sister, silently refusing the assistance. She went back into the house and emerged a moment later with the single suitcase which she shoved into the back of Gracey's cab. Wordlessly, Tiny slid into the front seat and leaned her head against the window. "You have everything you need?" Gracey asked. Tiny closed her eyes. "I need my mother to be human," she said. "Otherwise, I have everything. Let's just go." Gracey breathed in through her nose, exhaled through her mouth as she put the truck in gear and pulled away from her childhood home, her mind screaming that it wasn't too late to go back, that she still had a chance to set everything right. She could yet walk right back in that house and dress her mother down for repudiating her youngest child. But the fantasy quickly evaporated as the distance grew and the house became smaller and smaller, eventually winking out of existence. They drove for hours in near silence before Tiny asked, "So, tell me about this place I'm moving to. What's it called again? Leavenworth or something?" Gracey chuckled, tossed the curls from her face. "Love and War," she said. "I think Leavenworth is a prison." Tiny blew out through her nose. "Fitting then, I guess. So what do you do out there? Mama doesn't really talk about you much." Though not surprising, the news twisted in Gracey's stomach like a knife, causing her skin to pimple over and her scalp to burn. "I call her every Sunday," Gracey said lamely. "She tells me about you, sort of. Said you were getting a degree in sociology?" Tiny snorted, rolling her eyes. "I dropped out of LSU last year. It was a giant waste of time. I want to be an artist, and you don't need to go to college to do that." This was news to Gracey. Annette had never mentioned Tiny's career ambitions, but then she supposed that was par for the course. Daylittle women were expected to marry well, or, barring that, earn their living delicately through avenues like interior design or personal shopping. Getting splattered at an easel was not something Annette would have approved of. "So you're an artist? I didn't know that. What sort of art?" Tiny shrugged. "Paper crafts, mostly, but there's no money in it. I didn't think that mattered before, but now." She let her voice trail off, gave a shrug. "You didn't answer my question. What do you do?" Gracey cleared her throat. "I own a bakery," she said. She spoke self-consciously as she cast a sideways glance at her sister, who, by the looks of her, probably didn't eat carbs. "You own a bakery? That's pretty cool, I guess. How did you get into that?" The question made butterflies erupt in Gracey's stomach. It was innocent enough, the exact sort of thing people who didn't know each other asked. It meant nothing. It was a polite set of words intended to fill time and dead air, to move a dull conversation from one point to another. But in Gracey's case, the question was sublimely personal. It was a topic she rarely broached with anyone, as her inner circle was nearly non-existent. In all this time, no one had ever asked her why she'd chosen her given profession, and she'd never bothered to share. And yet, she wanted to tell her sister. It would feel good to get the words out, to let someone else in on her secret. But at the same time, their relationship was new and fragile, and Gracey's truth was wild. She didn't know how her sister would take it. But on the other hand, they were now roommates. She was bound to find out sooner or later. "You ever seen pictures of me when I was a kid?" Tiny frowned then, gave a small nod. "Yes, although I had to go looking for photos. Mama doesn't have photos of you in the house. You didn't look like anybody else in the family. You know, because of your dark hair and because I was fat," Gracey finished. Her sister merely nodded her meek agreement. "Well, when I was about 10 or so, I started having hallucinations, waking dreams." She had no idea how to complete this sentence. She'd never bothered to explain her circumstances to anyone before, not that anyone had ever asked. No, that wasn't true. Someone had, once. She shook away the thought as she cast about for an appropriate phrase. "I started having weird feelings. I'd be cutting out paper dolls or getting dressed for school, and all of a sudden, I'd get these powerful impressions of food. Butter, pineapple, Tahitian vanilla. It was like they possessed me. I couldn't shake them. It happened at the most random times, and of course, I just ignored it at first. But over time, I couldn't. So what did I do? I tried to eat them into submission." She cringed at the memory, twin roses of embarrassment blooming in her cheeks. "If I started having strong chocolate feelings, I ate chocolate. If pecans showed up, I stuffed myself with pecans. But it didn't help. The feelings kept coming. If anything, eating made it worse, but by then I couldn't stop. And as a result, I got fat. My weight drove Mama absolutely crazy." Gracey noted from the corner of her eye that she had her sister's rapt attention. It was encouragement enough to plunge on. "She put me on all kinds of diets, sent me to see nutritionists, even put me in dance classes. But when the feelings struck, I snuck the food. I was willing to do anything to try to make them stop. I didn't even want to eat, but I wasn't really in control." "I know it sounds like I had an eating disorder," Gracey said, shaking her head, "but that's not how it felt. It was more like the food was trying to tell me something, but I just couldn't speak its language. It wasn't until I went to college that I finally figured out what the food wanted from me. I met a girl in my political science class who invited me over to help her make a pie for the 4th of July. As I started baking, the food sensations just sort of exploded. I started mixing ingredients together while she put on music, and suddenly everything just came together. I didn't even need a recipe because the ingredients told me how to mix them together. That's what they had been trying to do all along. They were trying to get me to mix them together, and I was eating them. She laughed at the memory, gave her head a small shake. But that day, that's how I discovered... Tiny wrinkled her brow. Discovered what? Gracey paused. What she was about to say was crazy. It would either push Tiny completely away or draw her in, but there was no way to know which it would be. She'd gotten this far, so there was no turning back. She had to roll the dice. The baker took a deep breath before saying, "It's how I discovered that I can bake music into pies. I can take the emotions from songs and put them in a pie. And when you eat it, you feel the song, but like 10 times more." She held her breath, waiting for her sister's response. She was prepared for rejection. She was ready for incredulity. She could probably even stomach being laughed at. But she was not expecting Tiny to say, "Only pie? Not cake or muffins or anything?" Gracey smiled. "Only pie. I have no idea why, but believe me, I've tried other things." The younger Daylittle gave a low whistle. "That's wild. And completely batshit crazy, if you don't mind me saying so." And there it was, the ridicule Gracey had been expecting. She was glad that she hadn't let Tiny's initial reaction give her any false hope that her sister would understand. Who could, unless they'd experienced it themselves? Even Gracey's patrons couldn't really admit why they kept coming back to her shop day after day. Even her private order business, which brought in more than twice the revenue of her public bakery, catered mainly to bashful individuals who claimed they just craved that off-season rose-petal chutney pie, never mind the fact that it was baked with the sultry emotions of Bruce Springsteen's "I'm on Fire," destined to conjure in the eater near-desperate feelings of desire. It was the flavor they desired, of course, not the magic baked in. What a ridiculous idea. Gracey shook the thought away. "So, can I ask you something?" Tiny raised an eyebrow, shrugged. "I guess." "What made you decide to have the baby? You have options, you know, at least for another few weeks." She let the implication hang in the air between them. Tiny sighed. "Not that you really have a right to ask," she said, her tone carrying only the barest touch of irritation. "But I want the baby. Besides, do you remember when I was around 6 or so and I found that injured nutria out by the pool, and Mama told Daddy to get rid of it, and I cried and begged Daddy to let me make it better?" Gracey breathed out a little sigh. "I'd forgotten about that. Daddy helped you build a nest for it in your room. Mama just about died when she found out." "I did rescue it, though. I saved it. I couldn't bear to let that poor little thing die." "You had a very soft heart," Gracey agreed. "Yeah. Well, I mean, that was just a rat, Gracey." "I see." They drove another 5 miles in silence before Tiny said, "So tell me something about Leavenworth. What's it like?" Gracey chuckled then, blowing hot air out of her mouth. "Well, it's nothing like New Orleans, that's for damn sure. Let's see. It's a little town on the edge of the Chihuahuan Desert. Population is probably around 1,500, 2,000 people, something like that. It's a hodgepodge of Mexican and Japanese cultures. Most everybody there is a blend of both. Though my understanding is those cultures are more like influences." Our little town isn't really a snapshot of the originals. I guess time and distance can do that. It's a little like New Orleans in that way, just not French. Tiny lifted an eyebrow. Anything else? You mean, are there other ways in which it's like home? Tiny shrugged. Yeah, I guess. Gracey vocalized a sigh and lifted her shoulders. No, I mean, there's exactly one bar, a handful of diners, and stuff like that, but nothing like home. Except it feels weird to say that out loud, because it is my home. New Orleans hasn't been my home in a long time, if it ever was. Tiny sucked her teeth and rolled her eyes. You grew up there. Of course it was your home. Gracey hummed, letting the silence settle in between them before saying, You know that story about how the Inuit have something like 100 different words for snow? The what? Inuit, the indigenous people of the Arctic. Oh, sure. Go on. Well, English needs more than one word for home. You know. She counted on her fingers. There's home where you grew up, home where you live, home where you discovered who you are, home where nothing can hurt you and everything is second skin. She placed her hand back on the wheel. For me, those are all different places. New Orleans is home, Love and War is home, Lafayette is home. Does that make any kind of sense at all? Tiny pulled her hair off her neck, piled it atop her head. Not really, she said. Well, you're young. I guess New Orleans is the only home you know. I guess so. Tiny watched her sister out of the corner of her eye. You talk weird, she said. You sound all spiritual or something. Gracey chuckled, choosing not to be offended. I guess I do. That a bad thing? Tiny shook her head, the sun blazing right through her head full of copper curls. No, just different, she said. After a while, she said, You seem okay, I guess, circumstances being what they are. Gracey blinked in surprise. Do I? I guess I feel okay. Now. That's awesome for you, Tiny sneered with more than a little sarcasm. But it's not what I meant. I mean, I didn't know who to expect you to be. Not that anybody really talks about you, but when they do, they make it sound like you left home because you thought you were too good for the rest of us. Gracey snorted, shaking her head. If only Tiny knew how opposite the actual situation was. But I don't know, you don't really seem snooty or whatever. I mean, I haven't seen you since I was 10 or 11 or something. So, why did you leave home? How come you never came back after Daddy died? Gracey's ears burned hot, aware of the subtle reproach in her sister's question. Her inclination was to lash out, to tell her sister to mind her own business, to push her away with all the heat and anger she'd stored up in her own heart over the last 10 years. But that wouldn't be fair. Tiny didn't know the minefield she was stepping into. Her inquiry was merely the simple interrogation of a kid sister left alone in a huge, empty house with a cold, distant mother. She probably didn't know the whole story, that a week after Gracey lost her father, her entire world was shattered. Gracey pushed away the thought, even as a single word bubbled up through the miasma of her subconscious. Gabe. I left home because I was 18 and that's what you do. Well, what most people do. Present company accepted. You know what I mean. Gracey sighed, pushed her curls out of her eyes. I don't know if I can explain it all to you. I had to leave home because there was so much unhappiness in that house. No matter what I did or who I tried to be, I didn't fit. I was like a pair of skinny jeans on a body that wanted bootcut. Gracey puffed her cheeks and blew out hot air, increased her grip on the steering wheel. My leaving had nothing to do with you, and I hope you know that. But I had to go find my own home. So I went to college in Lafayette, and then I ended up in love and war. And there, nobody asks why I didn't become a debutante. Nobody asks why I didn't go to Aunt Bee's funeral. Certainly nobody comments on my hair or my cowboy boots or asks when I'm going to lose weight. I keep to myself and I bake pies and nobody bothers me. Nobody can hurt me. Tiny frowned. So that's why you ran away to the desert? So you could hide in a bakery where nobody can hurt you? Doesn't sound like much of a life to me. Gracey bristled. I'm not hiding. Tiny shrugged. Well, that's what it sounds like. Well, I can't help what it sounds like to you. I'm just telling you that's the way it is. Tiny grunted. You don't have to be bitchy about it. God, defensive much? The silence between them grew barbs, and Gracey wanted to kick herself for her behavior. She needed to be gentler with her sister. Kinder. Considerate. Treat her with kid gloves, no matter how much she pushes your buttons, Gracey scolded herself as she drove. And when you get home, bake her something nice. It's the only way she'll understand. As the odometer ticked higher and the desert grew closer, Gracey felt a new recipe bubble up from her depths. Raspberry custard sisterhood pie. 1 cup raspberries. 3 duck eggs. 1 cup sugar. 1/4 teaspoon salt. 2 cups milk. 2 tablespoons flour. Bake to the tune of He Ain't Heavy, He's My Brother by the Hollies. Blend eggs, sugar, and salt. Beat until fluffy, then slowly blend in milk. Look up from the bowl to catch the smile of the little girl standing on tiptoes to peek over the counter, red pigtails bouncing as she asks what you're doing. Sprinkle 1 tablespoon of flour evenly over pie shell. Pat down your annoyance and frustration. The years will pass quickly. Time is the enemy, not this tiny bird in missing teeth and asking to lick the bowl. Add raspberries and sprinkle with another tablespoon of flour. Pour custard mixture over raspberries. Years from now, when she gets knocked up, get to know her all over again. Shoulder her burdens with her. Bake at 400 degrees for 45 minutes, then reduce temperature to 350 degrees and bake for 12 to 15 minutes. Serve with a healthy dose of patience. What am I doing? Gracey asked aloud. I left that place to get away from Daylittles. What am I doing bringing them into my life now? Between the desert and the darkness, only an answer of screeching bats in the distance was offered.